Here we go. Hope you can all hear me. We good? Good evening, everyone. We are live. We are back in business for another, hopefully, wonderful season of slideshows from the Arrow Lakes Historical Society. It's good to see you all virtually. I hope you can all hear me. Everything's coming through. Someone can let me know in the chat if I'm coming through all right as we wait for a few more people to come in. This is the first show that we've done since July, where we did a one-off for Canada Day, and we hope to resume our monthly slideshows now that we've all enjoyed our summers, hopefully, and getting into the rainier, snowier part of the calendar. I'm Kyle Cush, the archive technician at the Arrow Lakes Historical Society, and I am broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Sinaiaks people, the Arrow Lakes, and today's show is called The Wide, Wide World of the Arrow Lakes. I just want to show you some more wonderful tidbits from our collection. Over the past few months, I have uploaded about 6,000 new photos to our website, alhs-archives.com. That brings us to almost 25,000 photos on the website. If only there were $25,000 on the website, maybe I could get a cut. But so I encourage you to browse through some of those, and I want to thank Greg Nestoroff. He's been helping us with our Facebook page. We've been getting lots of great feedback from you on Facebook, and I think a few of those photos we've been throwing up the past few weeks might give you a little bit of a clue of what's in store for tonight as we explore the wide, wide world of the Arrow Lakes. So let's get started. And I want to start off by, we know lots of our ghost towns, the ones that were flooded out by the Keenly Side Dam, were the famous mining towns of the Lardo, but one that often gets left behind is West de Mars. West de Mars didn't exist very long, about 1907 to 1930. And, sorry, to which website? That would be alhs-archives.com. And, yes, Trevor noting the new PC. Yeah, this is the Windows 11, which has been out for, what, a week and a half? 2 weeks? So this is the first time we've been broadcasting off Windows 11, so just getting used to widgets and having it look like my iMac. So West de Mars, for those who don't know, was located across from where McDonald Creek Provincial Park is now. That was called East de Mars. West de Mars was a short-lived... it was meant to be an orchard-growing community, but it really wasn't. It was more of just a land scam to market to people from Eastern Canada and from England. Kootenay Orchard Company and companies like that would buy huge tracts of land along these lakes and say that they were perfect for orchard growing. Well, West de Mars, if you've been there, if you're from here and you've been there, you probably know it as the Bahamas, because it's essentially a giant sandbar. Not conducive for orchard growing, as the poor people who had bought their land sight unseen found when they got there. Not only was it sandy, but it was also completely forested. So to even have a shot at growing anything, you first had to clear it. And we see here a giant stump puller brought on a CPR barge to remove said stumps after they were logged so that people could actually settle the land that they were on. And this photo is the first of many that you will see in tonight's show from a photo album from Emily Slade, who was the matriarch of the longest lived family at Westamars. The Slades were there pretty much for 20 years. They came from Lethbridge. They were originally from Essex, but they came to Lethbridge first and then arrived at Westamars in 1910, 1911. If this name Slade sounds familiar, it's because her son was Charlie Slade, longtime ranger on the Arrow Lakes based out of Arrowhead. And so Charlie saved so many of his family photos, but we actually found in the museum downstairs just this summer this amazing photo album from Emily Slade in her own handwriting. These are all photos from the 1910s and 1920s. So there's Charlie Slade standing on one of those giant stumps. You don't see a lot of trees that big these days around here, of course, as we're into third and fourth growth at this point. That's the size of the original trees at Westamars. Uh, so that's what they had to deal with just to create. This wasn't even a farm lot the Slades had. They had a town site lot, which was about 1 acre in Westamars. And like so many people, before they could actually move into a house, they had to build it. And while they were building the house, they had to live in tents on the lakeshore on their own properties that they had bought sight unseen. This is the Cornell family in 1914. To give you an idea of what the landscape was like. Here's another family. This is the Faunches. So the Slades and the Faunches seen here together in 1912. Again, one of those canvas tents that people lived in while their houses were being built. And most of these families didn't wind up staying very long. Uh, Most only made it about 5 or 6 years before they finally gave up on the land and took their fortunes elsewhere. One interesting story is this Charles Meeker. Um, Here he is. He never actually built a house as we would know it. He built a sod house, like he was on the prairies. Um, this was actually labeled as Mr. Meeker's bunker on the back of this photo. Uh, as you can see, it's completely sod. He was a World War I veteran, and he actually passes away on the coast not too long after this photo. I want to do some more research on Charles Meeker. It seems like he has an interesting story. Um, Now, you'll notice it says that his dugout home is at Forest Glen, or Glen Devon, which is just around the corner from West of Mars. That's as you start going around the south side of Saddle Mountain back towards Arrow Park. One of the main families at West of Mars were the Mays. Uh, this is Bert, Emily, and Fred. The family would eventually relocate to the Shuswap. Emily May becomes a school teacher at Notch Hill. This is from the back of the Slade's garden, and then you can see the road and then the houses behind the other houses behind the garden. The building in the back left, I believe, is the Westamars School / Community Hall. This is Emily Slade, so the owner of this photo album. She had fairly crippling arthritis, and so to be, it's hard enough having severe rheumatoid arthritis in the 1910s as it is, but when you are in the absolute woods of West of Mars, this is Kitchener Avenue. Yes, it actually had street names. And as you can see, it's not much of a street, but and you can see the rather primitive wheelchair that she had to use. When Jack Slade, her husband, passed away in 1930, by this time the town site's pretty much dead. There's only a handful of farmers left, and that's when Charlie moved his mom out to the coast. She passed away in 1936, but She lived there for 20 years. Very, in that condition, a very, very remarkable woman, for sure. That's Jack Slade, her husband, standing in front. This is the bridge on Bridge Street. Um, I don't know exactly what creek this would be because there's a couple of creeks in that area. But that's the school at left. And then the storage shed for school is across the street. And you will notice a couple of names that are somewhat familiar in this area. Otto Karsten. So uh, Karsten becomes a name more associated with East of Mars and later with McCusp. And then Emmett McGill is one of the children in the back. And the McGills become more associated with Arrow Park and Burton later on. So they do stay in the valley. Not everybody leaves the valley entirely when West of Mars fades away. So West of Mars School, West of Mars Hall, you see that phrase used interchangeably. There was no church in West of Mars, so that's where christenings would happen. This is Reverend Stevens coming down Mrs. Cornell's baby. We saw the Cornells camping on the waterfront a few slides ago. This is their child being baptized. This is a remarkable find inside that photo album. It's the only known photo taken inside West of Mars School. And of course, the lighting isn't that terrific, but nonetheless, it's really neat to actually just have a photo from inside West of Mars School. Here's some kids learning to swim. We have the May family children again, and a girl named Ivy Wortley, who shows up in a lot of these Slade family photos. So the Mays, Wortleys, and Slades must have been fairly close. And as you can see, learning to swim, West of Mars, 1917. It shows you how narrow the Narrows are. This is looking north towards McCusp. And you can see beyond the point where the lake, the south end of Upper Arrow Lake, opens up. Here's another family, the Wells, sawing firewood. This is probably a posed photo. I don't know if Joyce Wells herself is doing too much of the hard sawing on this one. As I mentioned before about Facebook teases, here's the first tease that we got last week on Facebook. This is R.L. June's storehouse at West of Mars being slid into the lake. So Robert Levi June lived at Burton in the late 1900s and early to mid 1910s. He ran a store at Burton, general store, and he also had storehouses up and down the Narrows because he delivered goods from his store to the entire Narrows. And I first saw this actually in the book. The first shot that comes is this. And I just see this building that says on its way to Burton City. And I was very confused. And then I turned the page and realized, oh, they've actually purposely slid this building into the lake to float it down to Burton. And I guess if you don't have a barge, apparently Mr. June was one of his biggest commodities was making fence posts, and his store was renowned, if you can put it that way, for its black fence posts. This is Ross Chittick and his ox team. Who needs a horse and wagon? We can have oxen and wagon. And then you see some kids from West of Mars, or a family, hanging out in the wagon and back. Another way of transport, again, there's no road to the cusp at this point. Even now, it'd be pretty difficult to drive to West of Mars, let alone 100 years ago. So it's just easier to row. So here's the Wortley family and Jack Slade with that very distinctive mustache, second from left. rowing their way to Nakus to go to shopping because that was the nearest store. Um, that would be about, 7 miles? Uh, 13K or so. So a pretty decent row. So going to town is an all-day event. And here's what it looks like when they got to town. This is a great shot of Nakus from the Emily Slade photo album, and this is what you would see as you rode into town from up the lake. You see the Leland Hotel and the Grand Hotel up on the hillside, and then the CPR railway station bottom left, CPR wharf. That's the government wharf at the right, and you can see that very familiar CPR workshop that we've seen in so many slides hanging out behind the government wharf. But a great shot of Nakusp waterfront in the early 1910s. So obviously Emily Slade had some trips into the Okanagan because we see a decent handful of photos from Vernon and Kelowna in this collection, and this is one of the more interesting photos. This is the SS Aberdeen having crashed into a boathouse at Okanagan Landing, which is now within the city of Vernon, at the head of Okanagan Lake, where all the stern wheelers would head south for Kelowna and Penticton, point south. But yeah, it's very rare that you actually see a picture of a boat crashing into a boathouse or having crashed into a boathouse. Amazingly, that wagon stayed on. The bow didn't fall over. As I mentioned, most families didn't stay too long in West Des Mars. It just was not meant for farming. There's a reason that Arrow Park and Bird's Landing and Burton and especially Edgewood and Renata took off, and places like West Des Mars and Fosthall did not. And there were numerous places like that on Kootenay Lake as well that were kind of marketing questionable farmland to people on lake shores. But here's the Wortley family giving up on West Des Mars and taking off for Windsor, Ontario. And so we see the townsfolk, what's left of them at this point, saying goodbye to the Wortleys. And they're obviously they kept in touch because there's actually pictures of the Wortleys and other West Des Mars residents in Windsor that Emily Slade had in his photo album. So 4 years later, we're already getting photos captioned with "meeting of old timers at West Des Mars Wharf." Even though the town's only 15 years old, it's already past its heyday, and most of the people have moved on. The most distinctive feature about West Des Mars was probably the wharf house on the West Des Mars Wharf, with West Des Mars painted in bright white lettering so that the sternwheelers could see it. Unfortunately, nobody's identified in this photo, but it is a great shot. And it is a sort of a reminder that people, even though they left West Des Mars, there were relationships and some sort of affinity for it. This is the latter days of West Des Mars, and now you'll notice that this photo is not from the Emily Slade album, it's from the estate of Peggy Conkin, who was maiden name Peggy Ratcliffe, and her family was from Bird's Landing, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, and that was just a couple towns, if you would use that term, southwest of West Des Mars along the Narrows. So here's a small musical group of the Winterstein and Ratcliffe family at West Des Mars in 1929. So this is right at the end of West Des Mars. Like I said, it really didn't go on past 1930. Here's what the West Des Mars waterfront looks like in 1928. And as you can see, there is all of one building and two boathouses in addition to the Wharfinger's house. Uh, you do notice that there is some orchard land. It's a bit dark, but there are a few attempted orchard uh, plots in the background behind the wharf. Um, that bank does not look very stable. It looks like it can erode pretty easily. Like I said, it's all dirt. It's all sand. Um, we move from the world of Westamars into the world of weather. Some fun weather moments or not so fun weather moments captured on film. Here is a shot of a seaplane at Rothwell Bay during a storm. It's interesting how few pictures are actually taken during storms. Everybody wants pictures of things when they're beautiful and sunny and nice, but sometimes it's more interesting to take pictures of things when they're a bit hairier. Saddle Mountain in the background, but I can't imagine that would have been very fun to keep upright to stop from sinking that plane during such a storm. You can see how violent the waves are there. That's 1961, which was a flood year. Um, Not quite the flood of 48, but a pretty decent flood year nonetheless. This is the waterfront at Renata in 1961. And again, you can see that when you combine flooding with massive waves, it makes for pretty violent imagery. And you can see by those drowned trees just how high up the water is. Many buildings were flooded that year along the Arrow Lakes, as we'll see in some later photographs. Um, and another thing you have to worry about in a mountainous area, of course, are landslides. This is a landslide at 1934-35. These are bunkhouses for mill workers above the waterfront at Arrowhead. You can actually see a boat docked at the bottom right there. But as you can see, these houses got shifted quite a bit by this landslide. Interesting that it looks like it's almost more of a slough or a slump than a real violent landslide. Not enough to knock anything over, not even the power lines, but enough to tilt them quite a bit. Interestingly enough, in the background, you see the top of Mount Sproat. You see a giant scar on Mount Sproat, and that was from a slide 31 years earlier in 1903 that actually caused a fairly decent, almost a mini tsunami on the north end of the lake. And that slide is still decently visible today, that scar on the top of Mount Sproat. This is a shot from the collection of James A. Terry that we received a couple of years ago. And this is one of the many washouts that occurred along Carpenter Creek, just because we're all famous with the famous 1955 washout that destroyed most of the town site. But this is actually caused in 1933 by mine tailings sloughing into Carpenter Creek via Sandon Creek. So big pile of mine tailings collapses into Sandon Creek. So Sandon Creek gets pushed into Carpenter Creek and causes the plume underneath the town site of Sandon, underneath Main Street, to plug up, and then of course the flume explodes. Not nearly as big as the one in 55 that destroyed most of the town, but still leaving quite a bit of debris. Here's some more shots of the debris left by the washout. Now you can see the flume actually containing Carpenter Creek under Main Street, which they did to provide more building space in the narrow confines of the valley that contained Sandon Town Site. You can see the CPR tracks actually hanging over the side of the creek at left, hanging off the back bank. Speaking of slides, this is a more recent one. This is 1978. And this is at Dinner Creek on the Hot Springs Road. And Fred Piggott just happened to be driving his machine by this gravel pit when the side of the gravel pit, one of the mounds of dirt at the gravel pit, collapsed and washed onto the road, and it buried Fred's machine. It buried a pickup truck behind it. Um, so a very, very interesting photo for sure. Um, it's not too often we get photos in the high alpine from 100 years ago. Uh, people standing next to the actual feet of glaciers. This is Frank Swanson of the Cusp, posing on the shore of Empress Lake, which is on the east slope of Mount Simons. Mount Simons is the mountain to the north of Saddle Mountain. You have Saddle Mountain, then you have Low Pass, then you have an unnamed hill area, and then Mount Simons is the mountain north of that, sort of right behind Fosthall. And that's where the big ledge is, but it's also where Empress Lake is. Empress Lake is just small enough that you can't quite see it from the cusp on the hillside. It's sort of lurking in behind there, to give you an idea of where this is. Of course, once you get into the Lardo is maybe after mining most famous for its snow levels. The snowfall that occurs in the Lardo is pretty amazing. Even to this day, the amount that you get is just colossal. You can still have bits and pieces of snow on the sides of the road if you're driving up towards Ferguson, even into June. And I know because I've seen it. And so naturally, in the middle of winter, here's the Ferguson town site. You need a good snow plower, and Selden Daney was the most famous plower of our region at the turn of the century. And this is him plowing Victoria Avenue, which is the main street through Ferguson. Now we just call it Ferguson Road. There he is plowing the main street in 1910. You can see the size of those snowbanks almost swallowing up buildings. This is a great shot here. This is the future Highway 6 near Hills. So this is the highway between the Cusp and New Denver. Imagine driving between the Cusp and New Denver, and this is all you're given. The caption written on the back of this photo says, "Back when we had real winters." And I think that's an understatement. From the same set. So the snowbanks are much higher than the actual vehicles driving on them. And it's almost like driving through a one-lane mud track. Like, nothing's plowed. If you can forget about two-lane highways, your car better have decent clearance to be able to even navigate a snowpacks like that. This is Walter Miller of Burton, later of Nakusp, plowing the Monashee Pass in the 1940s. 1940, to be exact. 1940 is the first year that they are actually able to open the Monashee during the winter. That was, for much of its early existence, a seasonal road only. And it really wasn't until the 60s that you could feasibly keep it open all year round. But 1940 was the first year that they were able to successfully plow a path along the highway in winter. As you can see, it's definitely not the snow plows of today, that's for sure. The Cusp, if you're here during the winter, you know that Broadway is indeed broad, and we actually plow our snow into the central median of the streets. We actually have a divided Main Street for a few days each winter until loaders and dump trucks like these can actually scoop up the snow and haul away. Um, the buildings look familiar here, of course, because they're all the same buildings that are still downtown to this day. This is looking from the corner of Broadway and 3rd, looking west. But you'll notice every single sign is different. None of those businesses exist, even though those buildings are exactly the same. All of those businesses have changed in the past 45 years. You see Wayne's Food Mart, that's where the Nakusp General Store is. Arrow Lake Supply, Nakusp Hardware, that's where Selker Realty is. High Style, menswear in the Nakusp Variety Store, well, that's Arrow and Anchor Pizza. That's Dog Sense Boutique. You can see Dunn's Menswear, which is Touch of Fashion now, over on the right. So it's neat to see all those old signs that actually aren't that long ago. Well within the memory of most people. Looking the other way, that same winter, uh, here's the corner of Broadway and Nelson from the plowed over parking lot of the Hut Holdings building that it's now the Saddle Mountain building where the medical clinic and the pharmacy and the dental clinic are. Uh, that highway sign almost illegible thanks to the snowbank. This is a great shot. I wanted to throw this in from the Ueda collection just because 14 more binders of Ueda family photos arrived at the Arrow Lakes Archives this afternoon. So I've got a long Monday ahead of me. There were 3 of us today digging through photos and picking out the ones that really showed different aspects in the cusp and people of the cusp that we don't previously have photos of. I mean, thousands and thousands of photos. It's going to take us days, but it's a great problem to have. We're so thankful to the executors of the Ueda estate for letting us access these wonderful photos. So this is Mr. Ueda on top of his house. He would have been well into his 70s at this point, nearly 80 in 1972. And this is a couple blocks south of the high school in the cusp. We go back to 1968. This is a business that is still there. Hewitt's Auto Repairs, and when you see the first photo, you would be hard pressed to realize that there's actually a car under there, and it's only until you see the next photo that you realize, oh, there's a car under there. It'll take a while to dig out. One of the more famous landslides, perhaps the most famous landslide on the Arrow Lakes itself, was the 1953 landslide on Needles North Road that took out the 6-year-old Watchan power station, which had to be rebuilt for obvious reasons. You can see the 2 giant power pylons, transmission towers, completely destroyed. You can see the actual powerhouse in the back, but what you can't see from that photo is that the back of the power station's actually swept away with it too. So it had to be completely rebuilt. And then oddly, in 15 years later, that one had to be rebuilt because the level of Arrow Lake was, of course, raised, and so the power station had to be rebuilt on higher ground. Stoney Creek, which is in between Fauquier and Burton, that whole stretch in between Fauquier and Burton where the highway narrows and moves around Grassy Point and Caribou Point has been it's a frequent target of washouts and landslides. This is one that occurred on the Canada Day long weekend in 1984, and that's the temporary bridge they had to put across Stoney Creek on Highway 6 while they cleared up the debris. going back all the way to 1948. This is Judy Parent standing on Highway 6 at Rothwell Point. So this would be this shot right here would be fairly close to where that island appears in Rothwell Bay each summer, to give you an idea. You'll notice it's right at the end of the 20 miles per hour section, as you can see just behind Judy's head there. That's how you know you're leaving the cusp. And of course, we're still using miles in 1948. But the whole entire highway is covered in debris. 1948 was the worst of the flood years of the 20th century. A big impetus for the implementation of the Columbia River Treaty, for better or for worse. We saw near the beginning of the slideshow that shot of the Canadian Pacific Railway station at the cusp, looking from the other side. Now here we see it on the right, and it's surrounded by floodwaters, but what really took the hit on the cusp waterfront is James Hakeman's Imperial Oil bulk gas plant. You can see the gas tanks completely surrounded, the office completely surrounded. The railway at right barely escapes. Of course, if you're familiar with 1948 flood, that was a massive year of flooding all around the Pacific Northwest. Much of Trail was flooded, and of course, the city of Vanport, Oregon, which was a suburb of Portland, was pretty much destroyed. So we'll compare this slide here of Judy Parent standing on Highway 6. Well, this is just up the road. That curve that you see is just in the background. Here is the SS Minto having to dock on Highway 6 because the wharf downtown is flooded. So this truck actually had to be, it was because the Minto basically served as a ferry as well at this time. So it did carry automobiles on the lower deck, and that truck actually had to drive off the center of the lower deck onto the highway. This is Burton. This is the Burton ballpark in 1948. Last month, we had a picture of Alan Keffer moving his tug Hercules to the Wat Chan. Well, here's Alan in 1929. Here's Mr. Keffer 19 years later, again, sailing his tug, only this time he's sailing it through the Burton town site. There's the Godon House and the Strachan House in the Burton town site, again, completely surrounded by floodwaters. And that's Lily Grimette's handwriting. And we'll talk about the Grimettes a bit later as well. Yeah, what a detour. Even in the middle of the flood, I guess you can still have a sense of humor. That's Lawrence Johnson, Lloyd Park, and Jarrett Johnson taking their rowboat through the Burton town site. 1955, not as big a flood year, but still a decent flood year. This is the Big Bend sawmill belonging to Selgar. That's located where Nakusp Public Beach is now. And that's what it looked like at the top of the flood in 1955. Another big weather event, not as frequent now since they've done some planting on the waterfront, but we still get them once in a while when the water's really low and it gets really windy. You still get some brutal dust storms, but they were much more brutal in the 70s, that's for sure. And even when I was a younger child. But you can just see that haze from the waterfront walkway. But it's not all bad. When it's beautiful, it's pretty darn beautiful. There's the Spicer Farm, June 1956. From the world of weather, we go to the world of mystery. Recently, we've been asking for your help in identifying some photos, and there's so many more where that came from. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of mystery photos. Here's just a sample. This is one that was on a slide that was found in the museum a couple months ago. And we threw this online, and we were able, thanks to you wonderful internet sleuths, to determine almost right away that the man in front was Joe Stanley, and Joe Stanley was the ranger on top of Saddle Mountain Lookout at this time in the 60s. And we think those are probably members of the Raven family. I think we have got Jack Raven at left, and possibly David Raven at top left, actually on the stairwell there. So if you can stare at this, blow this up on your 75-inch TVs and pick out a couple of people, drop us a line. But what a great shot of Saddle Mountain. And that lookout is actually built on top of the ruins of the previous lookout, which was burned, destroyed by lightning in the 40s. In that same set, it seems like this was a set of camera equipment, photographic equipment, and slides and negatives that had just been used at some point in the past for a museum display, and then sort of left aside. A whole bunch of very differently aged photographs and negatives and slides, all lumped together. So these come from different people, but this was in that same set, believe it or not, as that Saddle Mountain Lookout photo. This is a glass negative, and thankfully we've got a brand new scanner this year that does an excellent job with glass negatives. Like, that's a 120-year-old photo or thereabout, and the resolution is just incredible. The father looks very stern. Children look a bit happier. So there were 3 glass negatives in this set, and just judging by the architecture, we figure, okay, it's probably Central Europe. We do see a house number on this house, but this is the same family that was in that previous negative. If you zoom in closely, you can tell immediately that's the same family. So you see some of the family posing on the sidewalk, and then different members posing in the windows of the house. Pretty neat. But it must be a German-speaking country, because you can see the graffiti on the top left. And of course, the cusp has massive Central European population. So this has to bear some relation to a Nakusp area family. It's just a matter of which one. But yeah, the kid's looking pretty adorable. It's kind of rare to see kids smiling in photos at that time. You don't see a lot of people smiling in photos of that era very often. So that's a really nice, candid shot. Also rediscovered in the past couple of months, more slides that came to us from the collection of the late Rodney Eel. These were more glass plates. Now, through his family connections, Rodney Eel inherited a lot of John Nelson material. But this set of glass negatives that we're about to look at here doesn't really fit in with that. We know that this is 1919 in Saskatchewan, and the only reason we know that, well, just besides the fact that it's really flat, is the license plate. There are actually websites where you can go and look at old license plates and match them up, match up the design. So we know that that is Saskatchewan license plate 1919. Who these people are, goodness knows. In the same set, of negatives are 3 shots of soldiers in England on motorcycles. And we know it's England, again, because of the license plates and the types of motorcycles that are there. That's an Indian motorcycle, famous Indian mark. And there is another type of motorcycle I forget, but there were 3 of them that were just like this. Soldiers posed in this garden on early motorcycles. And then the last photo, or the last glass negative, was actually held together with Scotch tape. As you can see, it's broken in 3 pieces, but when you put them together and you scan them, you get this, a photo of a poster from World War I, alerting the public, showing them how to discern German aircraft from British aircraft. Go back even further. George Eastman didn't come along with Kodak film, safety film, as they called it, until 1884. Up until the 1880s, when you find photographs, they're usually first they're daguerreotypes, then they're on copper, and then they move to what is called a tin type. So rather than a black and white, you get this odd, very chrome / sepia thing, because these are actual. This is actual emulsion on metal. So very distinct looking photographs. It's interesting how the cheeks appear rosy in both of these photos. This comes from the estate of the late Ruy Hamer, longtime organist at the United Church in the Cusp. There are no names attached to these, so we don't know who these people are. Because they're tin types, they're probably between 1860 and 1890. And because it's Ruy Hamer, they probably were taken in Wales. That's where the Hamer family came from. But you can actually see in the top left of the tin type on the left, the actual metal underneath the photo, and how it's rusting a bit in the corner. This is a great shot. The Pickard family, Ed Pickard or Ed Picard, depending on how you pronounce it. Most locals eventually just settled into Pickard. Before he came to the Cusp and opened his shoe store, which he ran for many years, where Touch of Fashion is now, he lived in Revelstoke. He is the bartender in this photo. We don't know who the other people in this photo are. We don't know what hotel in Revelstoke this is. So this is probably one that maybe we should think about having Revelstoke take a look at, and see if the museum can help us there identify what interior of what hotel this could be. This is another photo that came to us this summer as part of a massive donation of Connect Club of Nakusp material. Just strips and strips and strips of negatives, and quite a few slides and a couple of scrapbooks as well. 1,661 photos. 1,661 photos. So while we're able to identify a great majority of them, when you just have that many photos, you're not going to be able to identify everything. I think I can recognize a couple people in this shot, and because it comes from a Canet photograph collection, probably has to do with the Canet Club and Kinsman Club on the Cusp. In fact, you can see they're all wearing Kinsman lapel pins, and one fellow even has a kinsman jacket. But where this is, question mark, and exactly who everyone is in this photo, we don't know. So if you're around in the 60s and you can recognize the folks in this photo, they'll probably go a long way in helping us recognize these same people in other photos as well. Um, Not all of, because a lot of these are more recent photos and they're not necessarily public club photos, they're more private casual photos. We don't put those ones online just for reasons of privacy. But the more formal club photos, absolutely, we encourage you to take a look through them and see if you can uh, pick out some of the members of our Kinsman and Connect clubs from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even up into the 80s. This is a photo that comes from the estate of Betty Walton. Betty Walton taught for decades at McCusk School, and this is one of her classes. Judging by the haircuts, this is the 50s or the turn of the 60s, somewhere in that range, and there are no names attached to this photo. If you are can pick out one of these people, perhaps you went to school with one of these people, perhaps you are one of these people, uh, there's a good chance uh, that I know somebody in this photo and I'm just too young to recognize them as children. But some of you with much longer memories than I do might be able to help us put some names to this photo. And I guess I don't need to linger on it. If you really wanted to look at it, you could just pause it. Also, from the same collection, Ruins of Unidentified Building, the Cusp area, 1979. I actually have a feeling that these are Dennis Stanley photos, and I just didn't change the label on the corner. These look more like Arrow Lake's news negatives, which would make sense. But we don't know what building has been ruined or is being, maybe it's being dismantled, demolished. Don't know what this is. And there are hundreds of unlabeled Arrow Lakes news negatives. Um, yeah, other than obviously being in the Arrow Lakes News negative collection, it was taken for the Arrow Lakes News. We don't know what building this is. If you can pick out the landscape, or if you were around in 1979 and remember a building being demolished, let us know. This is an interesting one because I had seen this picture. This is one of the first pictures I saw when I started exploring Milton Parent's computer. And he had labeled the woman on the left as Annette Devlin. Uh, Now, I showed this to Annette, and she went, "That is not me." And it isn't her. This is 1961. Annette still would have been a teenager in this photo. Uh, but it's labeled as Edgewood. If you were around in 1961 and you can pinpoint these people, I already know a few people whose wheels are probably turning right now, trying to pinpoint who these people are. If you know, we know it's a Margaret Williams photo. We know Margaret Williams took this photo. So if you know who this probably a mother and son are, let us know. So those are some of our many mystery photos. These next pieces aren't mysterious at all, and they're not even photos. We're going to go into some artwork. One of the more famous artists to base himself out of the cusp was Walter Wells, who lived in Glenbank for many years. And He had a very distinctive artistic style, and he used that uh, style to depict many of our historic buildings and other scenes around the cusp. Uh, and we found a whole stash of them downstairs in the museum this summer. And I just want to thank the museum for bringing them up to us. And so now we have this set of Walter Wells artwork. It's quite fantastic. Um, and signed by him as well. For example, most of these that you're about to see would have been illustrated in the late 70s or early 80s. That was sort of his heyday for this type of artwork. Uh, Here's the then brand new Nakusp Hot Springs complex. What a great depiction. It makes it seem smaller than it is, more intimate. There's new hot springs, but he also did illustrations of scenes that he wasn't even necessarily around for, such as the original Nakusp Hot Springs complex with the roundhouse in the middle where picnics were held, and then the different cabins and bathhouses. A great depiction of the old Nakusp Hot Springs. Um, This is probably as it would have appeared in the late 40s or 50s before the buildings started falling apart, but after it started to become overgrown, as you can see by the grass. Ooh, Bruce Rohn says, that looks like Anne Conway. So, if you know who Anne Conway is, uh, you know, please, if you can, let's get that verified. This is a great one, and as you can see, it's dated 1978, which is appropriate because the year before, this building was demolished. This is the Trading Post. The Trading Post was a sort of a second-hand store and general goods store that occupied the former parish hall or small hall, which functioned as a community hall for much of the 20th century in the cusp. Became the Trading Post at the end of the 60s, and it closed in around 75 and was demolished in 1977 to make way for the modern BC liquor store in the cusp. So that'll tell you where it is, right behind the courthouse on 5th Avenue, uh, right on the corner of the alley there. That's where the Trading Post was. And again, that was demolished in 77 to make way for the BC liquor store. This is a great illustration of the Hankey house. He's spelled Hankey with an I. It doesn't have, but nevertheless, the Hankey house in Browse, one of Nakusp's historic farmhouses. It's a shame. Those ones look really nice because they're still in the original plastic wrap, and they even have the sticker from the art gallery on them. This one, however, had been used and abused, as you can see by the stains, and even cropped out a couple of pinholes on the side. So it's not in pristine condition, but I thought it was important to show it just because, one, it's the SS Minto in front of a very stylized version of Saddle Mountain in the background. So it's a very artistic interpretation of our local geography and of one of our local icons, the Minto. Uh, this is Imperial Service. That's where Haas and Jill's Bistro is now. But for the gas station was founded in 1935. The current building dates from 42. So from 42 to 1990, that building existed as the Imperial Service, our Esso station. Of the depiction of a person sitting all by themselves, at night with just the light of the garage. Here's another great shot of the Leland Hotel, and look how accurately he drew that sign. That's, of course, still the same uh, like, today. What a great shot of another icon. On a side note, we recently received from the Trail Museum a set of blueprints of a proposed motel addition to the Leland Hotel in 1966 by Gray and McCullough Architects of Trail. I presume that hotel addition would have been the lot to the north, where that house next to that small outhouse next to the Leland Hotel is, because that's owned by the Leland Hotel. But yeah, it definitely would not have retained the charm that it has if a motel section had been added to it. So that didn't go through. Also, we received plans for renovations of the Pine Lodge from 1966. Pine Lodge. That's where True North Forestry Consulting is now, and not our area, but for something called blueprints for the construction of something called the North Star Lodge, and I think that might be meaning the North Star Motel in Meadowbrook, north of Kimberly. So I think I'm gonna have to get a hold of the Kimberly archives and see if these mystery blueprints that showed up alongside the Leland Hotel and the Pine Lodge are indeed uh, the North Star Hotel just outside Kimberly. Our next chapter, we go from hotels to general stores. Uh, I mentioned the R.L. June store a few at the beginning of the show, and uh, somebody and oh yeah, I also threw up on Facebook a couple weeks ago the Perry Siding store and the Pop In, and somebody asked if we had pictures of the McLeod store at Edgewood. Well, I think this may answer your question as we get into this section. Um, so I wanted to leave the cusp stores behind for this one and focus on more of the small town general stores, the true general stores. Uh, we'll go from south to north here. This is the Motorhead's Deer Park Resort store in summer of 1965. So, of course, this is 3 years before the end of the original Deer Park town site with the arrival of the dam. But a nice little shot of the cabin, snack bar, office, the Purity Flower sign on the bottom that says on the left. Sorry, actually says Deer Park Resort. So you have the resort store, and then you have the Deer Park store, and this is a great color shot from the Ellis Anderson collection. Um, and you have to love the vintage ads on the fence as well in full color. Orange. How many old orange crush signs are still around on some of those old stores that you see off in the country when you're driving through places? Of course, across from Deer Park, Renata. And there's a shot of the Workington's Renata store, the old gravity-fed gas pumps in the back. You see that add-on at the Renata store? That's the Renata post office. And then the Workington's house is behind it, where the store owners lived. Moving up to Edgewood. This is a classic Hughes Brothers postcard where you see the Arrow Lakes Hotel on the left, but then you see the Edgewood General Store run by Bill Banting, and then Bill Banting's previous version of the Edgewood store over on the right. So This is the view from the wharf, of course. Keep that in your head, that Edgewood General Store right above the wharf, because that'll come back in a couple of slides here. So we move from that. So you see the head of the wharf. Here's 1911 at the head of the wharf, and you actually see the Edgewood General Store on the right being built. So again, we see it here completed. There it is on the right being built. And then here it is, fast forward 55 years to the summer of 1966. And that is one of the, I don't know, that's still one of my favorite shot in the collection. Mm-hmm. And Bruce is saying Coleman's store at Renata. So on Facebook, like I mentioned a couple weeks ago, someone asked if we had a shot of the McLeod store at Edgewood, and we've got a few shots. In fact, if you've watched our other shows, you've seen me use a couple different shots of the McLeod store. So I wanted to use a different shot for this one. This is the Edgewood Cash Grocery, which is the formal name of the store, on Remembrance Day 1952. And the reason people are gathered here is because the cenotaph was in the middle of the intersection that separated McLeod's store on one side of the street from McLeod's gas station on the other side of the street. And there's the Jackson family in the early 1950s. So I'll out Penny Jackson on the bottom there. Just a great shot. And 1950s, if you were in the city, you would never see two horses and a cart tied up to a pole outside the general store. You wouldn't even see a general store, much less the horses. But here in the small town, Arrow Lakes, British Columbia, you'll still get that in places like Edgewood and Burton, where people are actually taking their horses and delivering things to the store. Yeah. Oh, at Deer Park, Bruce Roan says. So not, yeah. So that would be the color photo that we looked at. Yeah, because Workington's had this store at Renata, and of course, Motorhead's had the Deer Park Resort store. So I mentioned the cenotaph separating the grocery store on the right from the gas station on the left, and there it is, and they're both owned by Jack McLeod. That's one of the last shots of the cenotaph before it is taken apart and rebuilt in the new Edgewood town site. We move up Lower Arrow Lake to Needles, and he's most famous in the West Kootenay as a car salesman, but Reuben Berge was also, for a short while in the 20s, a store owner at Needles, and this is his general store. And here's that same store. You can see the shingles change, but the windows are still the same. It's been added on to here, but this is the Needles General Store in the 1950s or thereabout. This is right on the waterfront next to the ferry landing at Needles. So it'd be almost right on top of where the ferry landing is now at Needles. And there it is in 1948, surrounded by floodwater. That was a huge problem for Needles and folk here. Whenever there was a flood, it seemed like that was the place that took it the hardest. There are so many different photos of the stores of Needles and the stores and the hotel at Needles and the hotel at Folk here and the store at Folk here being surrounded by floodwaters. 1948, 1955, 1961. Here's the ferry inn at Folk here, surrounded by floodwaters. 1955. We see Julius Detta and Scotty Devlin. Scotty Devlin ran the gas station across the street. And even the ferry inn sign is half covered floodwaters. Here's the year before. It flooded the year before as well. You get a better shot of the gas station in the back. But as you can see, this was a common occurrence. 1948 was obviously the worst. As you can see by how high the water is, it's covered the entire first floor of the building. And again, that's pretty much right on top of where the current ferry landing is. Moving up into the Narrows, we arrive at Burton, and these are a couple of shots from the amazing collection of Florence Addshead. Florence Addshead took so many photos of the Narrows in the 1960s, documenting it in its last stages before the flooding of the lakes. So we see a couple of the more famous general stores in Burton. That's the Wardy Stones store on top and the Steers store on the right. This is a Ellis Anderson shot. This is right downtown Burton. You get two stores for the price of one in this photo because we have, I mentioned Mrs. Gourmet before. That's her store, the Burton Trading Company on the left. And then you see the Watson House at center, if you know the Watson family of Burton. And then the Arrow Lakes Consumers Co-op on right. That was a very short-lived store. It only existed between 57 and 62, 63-ish, maybe. That building was actually taken up to the cusp and became the first version of the Hospital Auxiliary thrift shop. Moving north from Burton, we come to Carroll's Landing. This is a great shot of Jim Drummond's General Store and Resort Cabins in 1965. Try explaining to people now that there was not just a store at Burton, but stores in between the cusp and Burton. But yeah, that's a great shot of Drummond's General Store and Cabins. And again, you really notice how narrow the Narrows were at that point in the background. Coming up to Arrow Park. So when we say Arrow Park without a geographic qualifier, we mean the west side. Because Arrow Park, which is on the west side, and East Arrow Park are two different things. Today we don't just call it Arrow Park no matter what side of the lake you're on, but this is the west side. So this is, you see the Arrow Park Hotel in the front, and then the Hemingway General Store under construction in the background there. Arrow Park Hotel was famous or infamous in this area for being the only hotel in the area that you could not drink at, that did not have a pub. The owners were very much into the temperance movement. So here's a shot of the Hemingway General Store after it's completed, and you can see the sign. This is the shot as seen from the wharf. On the east side, you see the G.M. Wilson General Store, East Arrow Park, winter 1938. I believe this store was later purchased by Billy Rogers, who ran Redlands Trading, and I think this became the second Redlands Trading store because both Arrow Parks had a Redlands Trading store. Initially, it started as an associative, almost co-op type deal, but eventually Billy Rogers took the entire operation over, and so he ran a store on each side of the Arrow Park Ferry. And that's the store. This is the store on the east side. This is a great shot. It sort of fits into the general store mode because you can see there is a general store on each side. But the most important thing about this is, look at the date. This is 1894 or 1895 in downtown the Cusp. This is the intersection of what is now Broadway and 4th. So that's the Leland Hotel at move my cursor around it here. Right in here, that is the Leland Hotel here, and this is the Madden House, which later becomes the Grand Hotel. Over on the right, you have the Bourne Brothers general store, and over here you have what is simply known as the Cheap Cash Store. No, it was not a store where you could get cash for cheap. A cash store meant something where you would actually have to pay, as opposed to taking a line of credit, starting up a tab. But it also meant that you could buy basic provisions for low price, I guess. But it's just funny to see something called the Cheap Cash Store. This is a somewhat damaged Matty Gunterman photo. This is James Lindsley in front of Ernie Roberts' store, located inside the Central Hotel at Beaton, as we now reach the north end of the lake. This is about 1927. And as you can see, even though it's 1927, you're not exactly seeing automobiles on the street here. This is a great shot. This actually comes from a calendar made by the C.B. Hume Company, Trout Lake. So this is a shot in 1903 for their 1904 calendar, and it gives you an idea of what the main street of Trout Lake looked like in 1903. This is pretty much right at the peak of Trout Lake when it has over 1,000 residents, which is kind of hard to believe now. Fast forward in time 50 years, Trout Lake is at its low point. But the store, however, is still located downtown. This is the Trout Lake Resort store. So the Trout Lake Resort consisted of the cabins that are now adjacent to the Trout Lake Wharf, and then this is across the street. The Windsor Hotel is just off camera to the right. It wouldn't be for another decade or so that the modern Trout Lake store that we know and love emerges and sort of brings the focus of Trout Lake onto the highway. Then going north, past the north end of Upper Arrow Lake, onto the Columbia River. Here's Sidmouth, and Reuben and Liz Pilkey ran their store there during the 30s and 40s. You can see them in both shots here, but I just love that Pilkey's General Store. The sign looks old and faded even then. It was after the Pilkeys passed away. It was succeeded by the Sidmouth Central Store. And speaking of the Trout Lake store, one of the gas pumps there comes from the Sidmouth Central Store. It was one of the gas pumps that was replaced by the two Shell gas pumps that you see in the center there. The other gas pump at the Trout Lake store comes from the Beaton store. We're coming toward the end here, so as we want to get a move on, I figured we should end with photos based around movement. You have the movement of buildings, relocating buildings. For example, the old McCuss Fire Hall that we now know, across from the liquor store. The old Fire Hall Collective now lives in that space. The building dates the 20s, but it originally was on the back of the lot toward the alley. In 1950, when the fire department was, basically outgrew the fire hall. It needed a proper sized fire hall for its fire truck. So it was time to expand the building. And so what they did was move the fire hall to the front of the lot and then build. So this is Doug Hakeman driving Harry Murphy's bulldozer to excavate the new basement that they're going to move the fire hall on. And now here they are. Here's the actual moving of the building, and as you can see, it's done by hand, and it's a little double exposed. And there they are, placing it down. But yeah, it's a very cool sign. You can see how much smaller the fire hall was back then. There's the final result. That's what the fire hall looks like in 1961. Very much how it looks like today. Only you'll notice the ambulance was based there too, because up until... Are you still streaming? Am I still streaming? Yes. Yep. Says excellent connection. Yeah, we're just getting one reading that says I'm streaming at 0 kilobytes per second. But according to YouTube Studio, I'm still on. So if somebody could give me a thumbs up in the chat, perhaps. We have the fire hall looks very similar to how it does today. It's basically existed in that same condition, but as you can see, at the time the fire department ran the ambulance. There was no BC ambulance yet. I mentioned the Burton Trading Company. It too was moved from one side of the lot to another to, in this case, to attract more business after the highway was relocated. You can see Mrs. Grumet standing in front of the general store as it's being lifted up, and then it was pulled by horses to the corner of Vancouver Avenue and Caribou Street. We tend to forget the names of the old Burton streets. But very cool shot. There's actually probably about 20 photos in this set actually documenting the entire relocation of the building. Okay, we're still coming good. Thank you. This is the Celgar office, and this is the same Celgar office that you see today at Rothwell Point. It had to be relocated uphill when the new Highway 6 came across Highway 6 to the old Highway 6 to its new location below the new Highway 6 when the lake levels were about to come up. So it was actually one of the last buildings moved, and a hefty task given the size of the building, but they actually managed to do it without breaking a single window. Again, you can look at the size of the flatbed trucks needed to move the building compared to the actual size of the building. That's gargantuan. How they managed to accomplish that is absolutely amazing. It's such a great shot. Another building moved around the same time was the Ron Jordan House, which later became the Powell House, Massey House. So here's that building it was right next door to the Celgar lot, because Ron Jordan was the manager at Celgar. So to give you an idea of how far they moved this house, all the way to the other side of the cusp. And as you can see, it's taking up almost the entire street. That overweighty on the right, of course, that's where CIBC is now. Other than the Celgar building, the largest building to be moved in all of this perhaps was the Beau Vista Motel, which was moved off the waterfront on Bay Street below the Leland Hotel and switched back up Nelson Avenue to its current location on the corner of Broadway and First. It's now called the Townhouse Apartments. But quite a great shot. Here you actually see the hydro workers having to lift the power lines to fit the motel underneath them. And this is both a moving shot and a mystery photo. This came out of that same collection of Kinetic photos. You can tell it's in the cusp area because you can see the twin peaks of Mount Burnham in the background. But I don't know what house that is exactly. So if somebody can tell us what house this is that has been relocated onto this new basement, please let us know. It's a farm somewhere in the cusp area. Going back in time to the 30s into the Lardo, this is at Marblehead, modern day Meadow Creek. If you have a house to move downhill, What better way than to skid it downhill on logs? And sometimes the building itself is designed to be mobile. Here is a floating logging camp cookhouse on Summit Lake. And it's kind of weird because Summit Lake is not exactly the biggest lake. When you think of floating camp houses, you think of places on the coast, or you think of really, really large lakes. Why would they need a floating camp house on a lake that's only 2 kilometers long? Who knows? But nonetheless, very, very cool shot. Um, Summit Lake was mostly populated by Swedish loggers and lumberjacks, by the way. Speaking of floating camp houses, this is more along the lines of what I would think, because the Arrow Lakes are 230 kilometers in length. And so Sid Leary, owner of the White Pine Lumber Company, had a floating logging camp. It was usually docked at DeMars, but it could travel up and down the lake as needed. You see building movement, you see water-based movement. Here's some land-based movement, moving of people. And of course, in the Great Depression, there is so much movement of migrants traveling across the country, looking for work, looking for a place to settle, looking for just something to hold on to in desperate times. And here is a family, migrants, with all of their possessions, traveling through Burton during the Depression in 1933. And oftentimes, when new families came into towns, uh, locals, depending on the area, might not be so receptive. There were many towns that had signs that said, "Migrants keep moving." They were struggling enough. They need more people. Uh, Not only did they bring their possessions, they bring all their cattle with them, all their livestock. So long wagon trains of basically the contents of an entire farm moving through towns at a time, as families carry everything with them they possibly could. Here is a herd of sheep being herded from Alberta through to Washington during the Great Depression, and in this case, being herded right through downtown Burton. That's the Burton Hotel in the background. And then some whimsical photos to end our presentation tonight. Thank you for sticking with me as I get my bearings back and try to get back into the groove of speaking to a camera and pretending like I'm actually seeing an audience full of people. I hope you've enjoyed it. This is an egg and spoon race on July 1st at the Cuss School Grounds sometime in the 1900s. And of course, egg and spoon race, you get a spoon, you place an egg in it, and you have to run as fast as you can without dropping the egg. Of course, if you drop the egg, it smashes to the ground and you've lost. This is a horse race on Broadway Street in 1912, and you're looking at this probably thinking, Broadway Street? Yes, Broadway Street. That building in the background is the Columbia House, and that is where Bon Marché is today. To give you an idea of what this is, can you believe that? That is the main street of the cusp in 1912. Here's a more modern race, although it is a throwback. It's a chuck wagon race on the opening day of the Arrow Lake Saddle Club grounds on Lakeview Park Road, Burton, 1981. We saw the egg and spoon race. This is a more traditional track and field competition. This is the main street of Arrowhead. Let's just change that. How did I not catch that one? So that's a horse race on the Front Street, Arrowhead. That's the Union Hotel in the background, and it's all decked out for July 1st. But a very cool shot. And we contrast that with this kids race, 1975, July 1st. Can you identify any of these young tights in 1975? I've got a couple clues, but I'm not going to make any solid guesses. So, with that, I thank you very much for our sticking through it on our first slideshow of the 2021-2022 season. Our first slideshow on Windows 10. I hope you enjoyed it, and I believe we will be right back here again next month. Our schedule between now and probably April is going to be the third Friday of every month. We've got a number of shows for you in the bag, and you'll probably see some brand new ones being made in between now and then, as well as the content continues to come in. We're going to hit 25,000 photos on our website probably within the next week or two, so that's exciting. And then I've got lots of fun office things to do over the next few months, but it's all good. I hope to see you all again in person very soon, but until then, we'll catch you right here on YouTube. Good night, everybody. Have a safe fall. A safe fall? What does that even mean? I have no idea. It's time to stop talking. Good night, everyone.